Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I've been called many things. The business guy is probably one of the more polite ones. It's always an honour and a privilege to be here. I left New Zealand in 1980, just ageing myself, and it's always a real privilege to be invited back to speak, particularly about something that's very passionate. I want to acknowledge the New Zealand government, especially the Prime Minister and Minister Wood, for showing the courage and vision to convene this summit. Don't underestimate the power and uniqueness of having something like this occur. What we're going to talk about, we're going to thread a few things together in my talk and then on the panel. And I think the tremendous challenge that faces us is the need to act on the urgency of climate change, whilst at the same time transitioning our energy and agricultural economy. And as stewards and guardians of our natural resources, how do we develop those responsibly, all at the same time delivering economic, social and environmental prosperity to all New Zealanders? This is complicated, and doing one thing over here can have a negative consequence over here. And I think it's very important that all stakeholders are involved. And I think New Zealand has some unique traits of pragmatism, innovation, collaboration, and our kind of trait of wanting to buck the status quo to really co-create a vision and roadmap to achieve the target that's been set us. And I'm a person that's very optimistic, and again in our talk we'll go through some different things. I think it's helpful though to look at some basic first principles. As consumers of energy and products and services, we want them to be reliable, accessible, affordable, and delivered in a sustainable manner. But the consumers that are doing that are generally not willing to sacrifice the first three in service of the fourth. And I think one of the fundamental shifts that we've seen in the last couple of years is that it's not an or statement anymore. I think increasingly in the US and Europe and the companies we work, this is definitely becoming an and I think that's really important. So we can deliver affordable, reliable and accessible products, services and energy and do it in a sustainable way. And companies increasingly recognize that they can deliver superior shareholder returns, at the same time driving social and environmental impact. It's also good to have a little bit of a reality check because New Zealand does live in a global context. So we live in a world, we have 1.5 billion people, yes, 1.5 billion people that have zero electricity, no electricity. We have another 2 billion people on the way between now and 2050, most of them going to the same geography where those 1.5 billion people are. We have hundreds of millions of people moving from poverty to middle class, from rural to urban, and those people's eating habits are changing. So people that are doing grain-based diets, maybe eating chicken and pork, are moving increasingly towards a beef and dairy-based diet. And The Economist did an article recently estimating that the increase in cattle and cows and dairy will increase by 30% over the next 20 years. So this is the context of the world that we live in. And this chart shows because of economic growth, that the use of coal, oil and gas, the trend line is increased use of those products. And the IE estimates that'll continue for the next 30 years. So in the US and Europe, for example, in the last 2 years, the development of renewable energy has exceeded that of all other energy combined, yet the increase is still persistent. So we've kind of flattened that increase curve, but we haven't got it into the dip. So we've got to accelerate the transition, and that's where business plays an important part. So very critical. And I think there's one fact I'd like to, because facts are important, is that for oil, I don't know if you knew this, that only 47% of oil is used for transportation fuel. 53% of oil is used for plastic, medicine, cosmetics, and other materials. So this is a tremendous innovation opportunity for countries in terms of finding replacement products, etc., replacement materials. So there's a set of irresistible forces that I think is good to understand. This is the world that business lives in. I live in California, and where we're seeing an increasing frequency of climatic incidents, both in their frequency and their severity. We just lived through some very severe wildfires. And at the same time, we just had record rainfall and snowfall that has caused a once-in-50-year wildflower bloom, which is beautiful. So this all happened in 6 months, which is kind of crazy. But that's led to more societal activism, societal concern, that's now translating into investor activism. And I think fundamentally, a lot of people like talking about companies are greenwashing and are greedy capitalists, but the increase in corporate consciousness about they have to do something has has risen and has fundamentally changed in the last 2 years. And so this is kind of creating the urgency, but also the means of how we're going to do this is happening with the rate and pace of innovation, which is really at a pace that's never seen before in the world. So let's talk about capital for a moment. Capital markets play a really important part in making this happen. So we have 3 types of capital. We have venture capital, and today the Prime Minister announced some funds to accelerate that. So that's where the entrepreneurs get their money to do their stuff. Equity, which is how the shareholders kind of drive their companies, talk a bit about that. And then debt. Debt is used to fund projects, not equity. And I think what we're seeing in venture capital and equity is a shift, and we're starting to see where debt is starting to look for projects that are sustainable and are driving positive environmental change. And the challenge for the New Zealand government and New Zealand business is how do we attract capital into this country to fund the kind of innovations that we want. A little bit like what we did with the movie industry. If I said 15 years ago New Zealand was going to be a hotbed for digital in movies, people would have said we were crazy. And we're able to attract the projects and the capital in this country with sensible policy to encourage that. So on the equity side, we're seeing exciting things. The assets under management, growth of sustainable assets, that's on the rise. Shareholder resolutions around the environment, etc., is on the rise. And we're seeing corporations like BP increase their disclosures and tying bonuses to climate change. I was speaking to the Chief Investment Officer for CalSTRS. So CalSTRS is the Californian Teachers Pension Fund. So they have $250 billion under management. They pay the pensions of 950,000 educators in California. And his view is they invest in oil companies and mining companies, and a lot of their teachers are about you should divest. And he said, no, we're long-term investors. We work with these companies to embed in their plans to migrate their energy to become energy companies and to move away from oil and gas, because there's no interest in cratering these companies that not only employ hundreds of thousands of people, but underpin the pensions of many, many people. So I think, so again, their model is about engagement and working with organizations to move the ball down the field. Whoops, that's another one. So how do we do this in a world where there's very low trust? So I don't know how many of you follow, there's a trust index called the Edelman Trust Index, which fundamentally says people have lost faith and have low trust in their governments. And I'd probably say that in New Zealand our trust is maybe a little bit higher. But we've also lost trust in corporations, capitalism, etc. And whilst I always say trust is important amongst everybody, there's a triangle of trust that I think is fundamental. And the work we do through my non-profit and working with communities around driving better social, environmental, economic outcomes around resource projects in Latin America and Africa is the triangle of trust between communities, including the indigenous people, companies and government is absolutely vital. And trust is not easy. We all know in our personal relationships, there's no magic to this. Trust is hard to earn, and trust is easy to lose. And we have to work every single day to nurture it. And in these kind of conversations, we need to trust each other. And trust requires radical transparency and enormous vulnerability. You need to expose yourself as a corporation, as a government, as iwi, or whoever you are, in a way that allows people to trust you, irrespective of what the consequences might be as a result of that. So that brings me to, we've done a lot of work with the First Nations in Canada, and a good friend of mine, Matthew Coon-Cum, who's just retired as the Grand Chief of the Cree Nation, which is the largest First Nations in Canada. He said Indigenous people want participation, not consultation. And I've heard those words flip-flop this morning. And what he means by that is, actually he says First Nations find consultation is insulting. So consultation implies I have a plan, I'm going to come to you and tell you about the plan, I'm going to listen to you and then I'm going to go away. Okay, whereas participation is you are having a conversation and you're co-creating the plan with me. And I think New Zealand has a unique opportunity for all stakeholders to participate in that and co-create the path forward to zero emissions. And that way you reduce the risk of failing because everybody has their thumbprint. This is very, very powerful. Very quickly, we've developed this approach with First Nation faith leaders, including the Vatican, Capital, Oxfam, and some resource companies. And the development partner approach is really an approach that's principles-based to drive a conversation to foster sustainable development, ongoing collaboration amongst people, and drive shared purpose. And the thing that I'm reminded about overseas, and this is not just the US, is increasingly people have lost the art of conversation, of getting into a room together, listening respectfully and understanding why people have their points of view and trying to find common ground. We all crave it, yet we can't do it. So this approach is really trying to weave that way. A couple of anecdotes about America. Yes, America is crazy right now. The politics is mad, but peel it away. Right now, the US electricity grid, this is just kind of a sidebar, by next year will be 40% non-fossil fuel based, the entire electricity generation, natural gas 35%, and coal in 5 years has gone from 50% to 25%, and in 5 years will be 0. And this is bottom-up change. And I'm a firm believer that change happens from the bottom up by every person and organization doing their bit to make a difference. So what are companies doing? So one of the frameworks that I like is what Dow is doing for its sustainability strategy. It thinks in 3 ways: footprint, handprint, blueprint. This is a deliberate 10-year strategy. They're in the 3rd phase. The first phase was my footprint. How do I reduce my environmental footprint within my operations? Then the second phase is then how do I, with my products they offer in the market, how do I reduce their impact on the environment when they're in the hands of their customers? And the third phase, which they've just embarked on, is recognizing climate change, access to water is tremendously difficult, is how do I work with everybody else, all the other stakeholders, using the power of my brand and the resources we have to develop a blueprint of action to change the world as we know it. And I think this is a really good framing for organizations. But the only way if it's going to be authentic is if it's anchored in the values of a company. And I think one of the big challenges for organizations is to do those things that are consistent with the values I have. Otherwise, you'll seem disingenuous. Huge opportunity. Everybody talks about products that are developed sustainably are better performers. So Stern Business School out of I think Columbia in New York, did a boil the ocean study, and they found products that are marketed as sustainable outperform those other products by a factor of 6 times. Okay, and we have examples. There's a wonderful New Zealand brand, I know Tim Brown, Allbirds, even though a California-based company is a New Zealand company. It has started off with a strong, sustainable message. Beyond Meat, one of the best IPOs this year, and Impossible Foods have just announced with Burger King a plant-based burger. And trust me, the beef looks like, acts like, smells like, tastes like, and literally bleeds like real beef. Okay, and I think New Zealand has an opportunity. How do you kind of get into that stream of activity? Because you're not going to persuade people not to eat beef. It just ain't going to happen around the world. So how do you give them substitutes that enable us not to have to use cattle to do that? Okay, I'm going pretty fast here. So last, what's government's role in all this? I think it's really important. I use this kind of concept of sandboxes and guardrails, and we've kind of touched on that, and springboards. A good friend of mine I lived in Denver for 17 years and gained good friends with the governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper, who's now running for the Democratic nomination for the President of the United States. And he said government's role is to create the environment for business to create value. Governments are often become too prescriptive, and the rate of innovation is such that government needs to just create an environment where business can thrive. And I think the Deputy Prime Minister from Samoa said it well, is capitalism and markets do work, but the government's got to provide the guardrails so it doesn't go haywire, okay, that makes sense for the country. And then provide the springboards that allow that kind of innovation and attract capital into the country. This is quite a complex and a balancing act for government. And we see all around the world where government tries to be too prescriptive versus principles and really let innovation outstrips it, so it's always behind the 8 ball. My clock says 1:03, I'm doing quite well. I'll skip the summary and then just go to last is a call to action for companies. You know, really develop a mission and strategy if you're an organization that's anchored in your values. And I think the participation, companies often forget about their employees, and I think the panel we're going to talk about that. You talk about all this external messaging. How about engaging your employees in a conversation and understanding who they are, because they are your best representatives. Do it in a way that's trustworthy and authentic. If you don't have trust, and we can see with the likes of Boeing and other companies, you know, trust vanishes really quickly, one incident, and maybe you'll never get it back. And the role of innovation is vital. I'm an innovation junkie. Innovation is about not new technology, it's about things that create new value, business models, approaches. This summit is actually an innovative approach to creating a conversation in New Zealand. And we can't do this by ourselves. I think we have to do it as a collective partnership, businesses together with all other organisations, not only in New Zealand but internationally, because this is a global problem. If New Zealand just changes itself, there's a tremendous opportunity to take that leadership to the rest of the world and that innovation. But we have to engage with the rest of the world, and make New Zealand be seen as Israel is, or as New Zealand is for the digital film industry, as a hotbed of innovation and a place to go. And that'll drive economic value in New Zealand as well as a path to zero emissions. And that is right on time. So 32 seconds, I did pretty well. So thank you very much. I'm just going to go and sit down now and we'll have a conversation with the panel and hopefully have opportunity to take some questions from the audience. Thank you. Right, so I'm just going to put my glasses on. So Wayne, we're going to start with you. You happen to be at the end too, that's really fortuitous. So can you talk about in the port of Auckland is how your business model has evolved and what were the drivers for that over time?
Yeah, it's it's really interesting and quite a big question. And we're representative, I think, of most business. We're facing technology, social license issues, community issues. So I talk about our journey for a little bit. It really began for us back in 2015 when we decided to try and increase our footprint into the Auckland harbour. And that forced we lost a lot of trust with the local community. And that forced us into some very serious soul searching about the sort of company we were, how we were behaving, and how we were operating externally. And then that took us down the route of thinking about sustainability in a full sense, both from an environmental point of view, a social point of view, and an economic point of view. So we did do some work with consultants from Singapore, Future Forum, who are an NGO. They took us through a program, and we have moved to a full sustainability program. We've moved to a full integrated reporting program and integrated thinking into the business. So we're trying to be much more open, much more transparent. It's that sustainability that then. So let me just backtrack. So our social licence is about our right to occupy what is a pretty special piece of land in the middle of Auckland. And if we don't maintain that licence with our stakeholders in our community, then we come under pressure. And there's a lot of people who think maybe we shouldn't be there anyway, or we might move one day. I think from our point of view, our job is to look after that piece of land and make sure we run that business the best we can, depending on what happens in the future. It drove us to look at our fuel usage. So we use a lot of heavy equipment. It's all diesel-based. So we set a target that we felt was aggressive, which was our 2040 carbon zero target. We had no pathway to get there. But that target has driven us to think about how we might get there. It's challenged us from an innovation point of view. It's forced us to talk to our suppliers how we might better do something different. And this is where the genesis of our hydrogen project came from. If we need to run our equipment on alternative fuel, maybe that's hydrogen. We're also investing heavily in supply chain, looking at better supply chain outcomes from an environmental freight point of view. I just want to move on. It's just a few learnings. And what we had to learn is stop the talking. We got caught up in the discussion, how we were going to go about it. And it's come through, today as well. We had to start. And as someone said this morning, start small, change your light bulbs, change recycling. And what we found, that really engaged a lot of our staff. And we hadn't understood the power of releasing our people into this space. Another comment, if you haven't got that full commitment from the top, don't bother. I wouldn't even start. And because I'm also CFO, so, my background is finance. It's forced us to look at the way we behave from a finance point of view. You need to change the way you think about your capital investment. You have to accept it might cost more to buy equipment that's environmentally friendly. You've got to change your way of thinking about that to an integrated approach from environmental, social point of view, as well as a pure finance point of view. You need to change the way you do your business cases. You need to change the way you look at your CapEx. And importantly, and we've struggled with this a little bit, is change your risk appetite. To go down the route of a hydrogen plant is a different risk profile than we were used to as a business before. So don't underestimate some of the challenges just in your normal processes that come down as you sort of move through this journey. I might just leave it at that.
Thanks very much. That's very insightful. Lisa,
Kia ora.
iwi Enterprise, amongst other things. So how have your stakeholders outside shareholders really influenced how you do your business, particularly communities, employees and other stakeholders?
Kia ora. Tēnā koe ngā iwi o Taranaki, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou. Kia ora tātou. Our stakeholders and shareholders are one and the same. Ngāi Tahu is 22 years old post-settlement, and we have 64,000 shareholders, tribal members, who have huge expectations. So they very much influence and assist to set the direction that we go in. They're represented at a decision-making table by 18 hapu authorities. So what drives that decision-making? Our commercial model has probably been no different to anyone else's, drive and grow that shareholder wealth. However, over the last probably 10 years, as we've matured as an iwi, we've very much got greater expectations, and our business model has had to adapt and evolve. And our shareholders, our stakeholders, our people have very much influenced that through determining what those values are, and also our core purpose, mō tātou a mō ka uri a muri aki nei, is our decisions are made in mind of us, the generation today, the generation tomorrow, and the generation after us. So all of our decisions must take into account the impact on future generations. Those are the things that drive us. But most recently, we launched our iwi climate change strategy. Now, in there's a strategic direction for assets and investments in our future, the economic arm of our organisation. When you're an iwi in fishing, farming, transport, tourism, etc., climate change is a significant strategy that we need to get our ducks lined up for future generations. So we require from our commercial guys a climate action plan that responds to the iwi strategy. That is going to require them to either diversify, adapt, transition, whatever you want to call it, or it requires an exit strategy. Now that's in our climate strategy. For example, if we remain in transport, what are we going to do to meet the iwi targets? We have expectations and measures of our corporate guys which require continual lowering of their emissions to a net zero organisation. Now that's a challenging situation for our commercial guys. So do we remain in transport? And if we remain in transport, what's the model? Are we prepared to invest what we need to invest to change our Ngāi Tahu footprint in transport?
Fantastic. You're pretty progressive.
Very
probably
progressive.
something for other organisations to follow.
Yeah, and I think out of the 64,000 tribal members, I've got the largest carbon footprint.
Oh, you
so
do?
That's a real concern, and that's another measure we've put across our organisation, your individual carbon footprint and how you're going to lower that.
And thank you for disclosing that as well. That shows
Yeah,
true transparency.
I'm not very proud of it, actually.
Thank you. Leon, you're in the dairy industry, which seems to be buffeting winds, but a very innovative organisation. So people often talk about the triple bottom line. So how are you thinking about beyond shareholder returns, and then how do you communicate that internally and externally in an authentic way?
Kia ora mai tātou. It's great to be here, and I think what's implied in your question, Peter, is kind of how do you use purpose and the way of designing your strategy to fundamentally change business models so you get different outcomes, both for your stakeholders, your investors and your communities. And Synlait's been through quite a fundamental repurposing of the organisation quite recently. And the first thing I'd say around how we got some traction there was it took us some time. It took us a good 6 months to really get to something that was meaningful and authentic for both our people and our stakeholders. And it came from us starting to think about and changing our mindset. As an organisation, we had to put people and planet at the same level as profit. And once we started to do that, we were able to have conversations to get us to an outcome around the purpose that we wanted to live by. And I think Lisa mentioned their purpose in terms of how it's driven their outcomes. Synlait's core purpose is doing milk differently for a healthier world. And we only got to that point because of the mindset shift that we made. But our purpose reflects the fact that Synlait's always been open to innovation. We've been disruptive to an extent. We're open to alternative milks by definition of that core purpose, but it also reflects our role in providing essential nutrition and our desire to live within the boundaries of the planet's resources and run our business that way. So that fundamentally started the conversation for us. But the other thing that I think was really important was purpose is really trendy at the moment, and you can go through this process and stick it on your wall and kind of walk away and say, right, we've done that. How do you make sure that it goes all the way through your organisation and gets traction with people? And we used a model which I think is worth sharing. It's around head, heart and hands, and making sure that all three are in alignment to create action. We talk about the heart being our emotional driver, and that's connected to purpose. It's our why. So our purpose, doing milk differently for a healthier world, that's our heart. It drives emotional change and gives people the energy to move forward. The second thing we started to look at was what is our ambition, and our ambition is our head. That's where we start to set goals and set ourselves targets for where we want to go. And actually to create effective change, we feel that we need both. The emotional aspect of our heart to drive our forward and the aspirational aspects of setting goals within our head. But it comes to nothing unless we actually take some action. And so this is where the strategy comes into play, and forming our strategy is where we take actions with our hands. So by designing from the core purpose out to our strategy, we got to a point where across our 8 strategic pathways, we have 3 of them that balance a really strong focus on people and communities, a focus on the environment and what we're going to do in those spaces, and how we build an enterprise that creates an economic glow for all New Zealanders. And that's now helping us create decisions, a bit like what Wayne was talking about, where it's not an or anymore. We're not sitting there within our management meeting saying it's either make a decision for the planet or for our investors around profit. We're finding ways to do both.
Exactly.
And if I can just share an example of that, we just installed New Zealand's first large-scale electrode boiler. Now, that came at a capital cost that was much, much higher than was affordable. And to Wayne's point, we looked at the business case and said, no, it doesn't stack up. And when we looked at it in 2 different lenses, we said, actually, why don't we discount the cost of carbon in the same way that we discount the cost of cash in our business models? And so when we modelled the cost of carbon at $40 a tonne, and it's currently at about $25 a tonne, actually the thing started to make sense. So that's an example where following through from our core purpose, taking a heart, head, hands approach all the way through to strategy, we find we're in a space now where we're making decisions that allow us not just to make trade-offs, but to make and-based decisions that are both good for the planet, for our people, and for profit.
Fantastic. And I think a key point there is it's an and now. Yeah, and I think that's a change in the conversation in the last few years. So let's take some questions. The number 1 hit for questions is anonymous, actually, is to ensure that none are left behind in the transition. We really need to start to bring those who are already being left behind forward. That's great. When do we start to do that? Who'd like to tackle that one? Wayne, you look... Yeah.
Well, I can
Catch the ball? Yeah, you go.
let me just come step. I can only really talk about it from a business point of view, rather than, I'm not going to talk about it from a full society point of view. But we are embarking on what we will call a full future of work program. And that's about taking our staff with us. And that's about dealing with the technology disruption that we've got fundamentally. And that program will roll out over time, but it is about support. It is about skill base. We work with futurists. We want to work with families to try and open up people's views of what skills might be needed and what jobs might look like as well, through to educational support and through to educational support if people actually leave the organisation as well. So I think as a business, I can only influence that from our point of view.
Sure.
But it's a start.
No, that's a great start. Leon, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure anybody needs to get left behind. I was sitting with in the question was, I'm looking at this panel here, and actually we're all connected across the value chain.
Yeah.
And, you know, Lisa's organisation is a supplier to ours, and we make product, and it probably goes through a transport network in terms of some ports. So my sense is one of the big opportunities in this space is we have to collaborate more across the value chain.
Exactly.
We're really guilty, even in policy setting, of trying to find a point of obligation for someone to carry the cost of this. And I think that's kind of quite 20th century thinking, really. We've actually got to start to cooperate across the value chain. And a good example of that is last year we came out with an incentive for our farmers to remove PKE from their feed system. We said, we'll pay you 8 cents a kilo of milk solids to do it. Now what happened was that many of our suppliers came to us and said, actually, Leon or Synlait, it's costing us 20 cents a kilo of milk solids if we're going to make this decision, but you know what? We're going to do it anyway because we believe it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So part of the discussion here is how do we meet halfway in the middle? How do we share this across the value chain? Not just upstream, but downstreams. Consumers are really willing to pay for a greener product. And so by starting to think about how we build resilience through our value chain by making these decisions, I think it's a really good way to bring people along the journey with us.
That's great. Lisa?
Can I just add,
Yeah, you may.
I'm from the West Coast, South Island. I was challenged by Kevin earlier, so I'm going to pick up a conversation with him later on. And I attended a community meeting at Blackpool on the weekend. You know, you're in the heart of the West Coast, where your economy's been driven by agriculture, mining, forestry, and you're either left or right. I really was quite surprised with the community. And people will get left behind if we don't have quality engagement and if we set policy and legislate across the top without ensuring we've done some really good work on the ground. And those people that usually get left behind are our smaller communities, our rural communities that get impacted on by big industry, and iwi, hapu. So,
Yeah, I think it's an important insight because, you know, we want to avoid what I call the yellow vest syndrome, which is, you know, what happened in France. So good intentioned policy that's directed at climate change affects the people that feel they've already been left behind. And generally anything that puts cost back into the system always affects the people at the lower end of the socio-economic factor. So the next question, actually it was third, now it's risen in popularity, is lots of talk about ag, but, you know, transportation is the greatest contributor after ag to greenhouse gases. We're being told we're not actually, nobody so far has talked much about it, either transport or transport infrastructure. So what's next for this one? So, you know, so obviously you touched on hydrogen a little bit, Wayne.
So, you know, we are looking at alternative fuels to try and help in this space, but we're also doing a lot of work in the supply chain. There's a lot of inefficiency in the New Zealand supply chain. We move, the way we say it, we move a lot of air around. We move a lot of empty containers around. Auckland is the import market, boxes come in, they're emptied, they're then relocated for export throughout the country. So we're looking at what we can do to use that empty box better. We're looking at rail options. Rail is very important to our future sort of strategy. So someone mentioned water before, and our supply chain GM talks about water as well. It will find the fastest route.
Yes.
And that's what we're sort of trying to apply to our supply chain. Don't move stuff if you don't have to, and move at the shortest distance.
Yeah.
But infrastructure then becomes really important. So rail infrastructure, roading infrastructure is, you know, it is a whole package there.
I might add a little, so the work we do in Europe and the US, I mean, if you look at it, Norway's got to, I think, with a very concentrated effort of subsidies and policy, about 30% penetration with EVs. And, you know, the jury's out. Is it electrical vehicles, lithium, hydrogen vehicles, I mean, you know, at an affordable level. So there's a lot of promise. And then the charging infrastructure for, you know, consumer transportation and then freight. This is complex and it's not an easy path. New Zealand with a more tight geography probably has an opportunity.
And our hydrogen project, we're partnered with Clareo, Auckland Council and Auckland Transport, who will trial buses.
Okay.
It'll be interesting to see where it does go with heavy equipment in time, even in the rail environment.
Lisa, you have a big carbon footprint, you told us. No doubt transport's part of that.
Can I defer it to David Prentiss? I'm sure he'd love to answer it.
Yeah. David, where are you? Wherever you're in the room. No, he's not going to put his hand up.
Disappeared, he's hidden.
He's going up behind him.
Yeah, well, look, it's sensitive, right? You
Yeah,
know,
sure.
we do have investments in transport in the industry, and we haven't yet received our climate action plan from our holding company in terms of how they're going to respond to that. But what I will say is that we're realistic as an iwi about the need to give time for change.
Yeah.
So our tourism industry are slowly transitioning all of our jet boats to electric. So I think we've got 3 or 4 now that have been transitioned. So it will take some time and it will take some planning, and in the transport sector we can't do that alone. We need to be hand in hand with local and central government and with industry.
Leon, anything to add in the world of electrification for transport?
Look, I think probably more broadly in both, Wayne mentioned infrastructure. I think infrastructure in general is quite a challenge for business to engage with.
Yeah.
We're a fair way behind in this country, I think, in terms of trying to tap that. So one of the projects we're trying to work on at the moment is to build a rail siding so we can go straight to Littleton Port from our Dunsandel site. And that'll take 16,000 trucks off the road a year if we can achieve that. But you know, a lot of the other areas that we're trying to do is trying to integrate with regional councils and utilities companies, and we speak to them a lot, but it's really important that we're thinking about this in terms of how we partner with them.
Exactly.
And those bodies making it easy for us to engage with them, to be able to run at the pace that we want to run, to be able to make progress in this space, because a lot of it is about sometimes us having to front up and fund that, even though it should be coming from a public purse. So, you know, it's a bit of a challenge, but I think, you know, we are finding ways to get through it.
Yeah, and I think even in California is probably the most aggressive part of the world on electrification of transport, and the challenge around building the right infrastructure, putting in the utilities are struggling with that. So there's different models, and I think only 4% of our fleet is electric, so kind of interesting. Next one, that's a challenging question. Climate change cannot be separated from social justice. Thank you for that question. So,
Let's take the next one.
the next one, yeah. Yes, we'll park that one. Okay, well done. Changing models is something that big business can spend time and money on. How do we support small business owners, which is important, working in their business, not on it, to adapt their business practice? I think that's really important, you know, because, I mean, small business is usually the positive employer. Big business is usually always going for efficiency. So how does small business play in this? How can we help them? Anyone? So, Lisa, maybe you want to...
Look, you know, what we're learning, well, coming from a community that's driven by small business, what we're learning is that we've got to collaborate together and work in partnership across the coast. As Kevin mentioned, we've got a very small population, so the only way we're going to do it is by collaborating and working together to transition as a community. And if you take on that philosophy of not leaving anyone behind, there we go, you know. We've got to be forced into the room. We shouldn't be forced into the room, but at the moment we kind of have to be forced into the room to look and find local solutions.
I think, you know, Walmart's model and other companies, as they look back on their supply chain and say, you know, we want you to all be renewable energy, you know, zero footprint. We want you to be organic, but they actually provide services back to those small businesses to enable them to get there, because it's a cost to them, but at the end of the day, they feel it's better if their supply chain meets those goals, if they help them and they're not left on their own. So I think that's important. Leon, are you working on your supply chain in any way, shape or form?
Oh, can I go back to that question on small businesses?
You can, that's the small business
That's
one.
the small one,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I wouldn't mind flipping it, because I actually think small businesses are a huge opportunity in this space. They're nimble, they're agile, they're often run by young, enthusiastic and energetic entrepreneurs that are world thinkers in terms of, you know, sustainability space. But the second thing is, you know, that they are bringing a way of thinking that is 21st century. And this is a 21st century problem, and we need to be bringing 21st century models to think about it. I come from a generation where we're very linear in the way that we think about solving problems. We say, well, we've got a problem, what are all the solutions? And we need to know what those answers are before we start doing anything about it. Young businesses that are disrupting all of our industries are using very iterative models. They're design-led. They're coming up with a minimum viable product in 2 months and getting it to market, and they're learning by failure. And I think that kind of approach is really important for the environment.
Yep.
And we should be tapping a lot of our small businesses and learning from them so that we can take this forward.
Yeah, I agree totally. That's a great insight. Wayne?
Yeah, I agree 100%. So all I can add, I think small businesses are actually teaching us and supporting us. So we have collaborated with a number of entrepreneurs. I'm not sure our board knows this. We've invested in a couple of startups. So we can learn that.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, we'll tell you later.
Okay.
So we can actually learn from them. So by being involved with them, we're learning to think and behave differently.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So the other bit I'd add there is our environmental goals, they only work when you do expand outside of your own organisation.
Yeah.
It's no good us being carbon neutral. So we've got to share that with the people we do partner with.
Yeah.
And I think that is a role we can play with small business as well to bring some knowledge. And, you know, part of our hydrogen project is just about the IP from it. You know, we are happy to share that IP with people.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Time for one more question, then we'll wrap. This one, it's a long question, so it's hard to read. But to what extent can publicly held companies, businesses, take action on climate when having to report quarterly and naturally be more short-term, kind of the markets? Do we need to disrupt the stock market shareholder ownership systems in service of this just transition? Great question. And, the short-termism of the stock market, although I'd argue that we're seeing through sovereign funds and other shareholders actually asking for a different approach. But anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a real issue for some listed companies and maybe for some international listed companies as well. But, you talked about it before. Investment models are changing.
Yeah.
And I think that is the key. And you do have sovereign funds out there, super funds, major venture capitalists who are looking to invest in the right places for the right returns and taking that integrated, sustainable, economic, environment and social considerations into play now.
Yeah.
It's going to take time, but it's changing.
Yeah, and you can be courageous too. I mean, Unilever took a bold step. It was very courageous, told the markets basically take a hike, we're going to do this, and it's paid for them. And I think that's a good sort of guiding light. Leon, any thoughts around this?
Yeah, I think, I don't know that they need to be disrupted, but I do think they're working through the similar sort of journey as business.
Yeah.
So share markets are starting to think about how they integrate, ESG into their thinking.
Sure.
I see it more in offshore funds, even working back through Australia, than perhaps I do in New Zealand at the moment, in terms of my experience. But I think we're evolving in that space, and I think we're also seeing it not just in the shareholder markets, but in terms of access to debt around banking systems and being able to access lower rates because of your environmental philosophy. So look, I think it's moving in the right direction. I'm not sure it needs disruption, but it's positive.
I think the pressure there is to start to accelerate that as well, as especially the sovereign wealth funds and pension funds are really pushing hard on this. Lisa, I mean, I know you're not public, but...
I'm not sure what I can add other than our investment framework, tribal investment framework, requires us to partner with others who have the same values as what we do. So we're very choosy about who we invest with. But I think there are more and more opportunities than what I've ever seen for iwi to partner and invest with others who have similar well-being outcomes.
I think that alignment of values are really important in partnerships. So to wrap up, we're going to ask each of us actually to have one important takeaway for everyone that they can take from us. So one thing. So Wayne, what's your one big takeaway?
I think I'll probably just repeat one of the points I made, and I agree. Get your vision right, get your planning right, get your strategy right. But move from that. Stop the talking and start doing something. That would be my key message.
Great. I think it's tremendous. Leon?
I think today is as much a cultural conversation as it is an environmental one, and culture changes one conversation at a time.
Yep, fantastic. Yep. Lisa?
One big takeaway.
One big takeaway, sorry.
Yeah.
You're talking about scratching stuff off your phone,
easy.
right?
It's easy because our behaviours within our business model are driven by our tribal values and our core purpose. So if you've got good, sound values and a purpose that ensures there's a well-being outcome, then you'll have greater success, particularly heading into the future that we know we're going to head into.
Fantastic. My takeaway is it builds on everyone's, which is really under the theory of change. Change happens one person, one organisation at a time. So I challenge everyone, Susie did that about your eating habits, so I challenge everyone here, what's the one thing you'll do different when you leave this summit that will help move the ball down the field? And don't wait for someone else, and don't say it's someone else's problem. What can you do in a positive way to move the ball down the field? So please join me in thanking Wayne, Leon and Lisa for a great panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.